And for our final presentation in our series, I am so happy to introduce our next speaker, and that is Megan Ferry from Union College. Megan is a professor of Chinese and Asian Studies in the Department of Modern Languages and Literature at Union College. She teaches Chinese language at all levels and various Asian American courses on Asian American film, gender and sexuality in modern China, and East Asian literature and culture. She authored Chinese women writers and modern print culture and numerous academic articles. She has a lot on her plate as well, and we're very glad that we have her joining us tonight. We're very excited to welcome you. Megan, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. But before we start, I would like for people to just briefly in the chat give a phrase or keywords about what you love most about teaching language. I have to admit that before, you can go ahead and start putting those in the chat. I remember before COVID started, I was so ready to stop teaching. I was exhausted. And COVID did exhaust me. I was also the Wizard of Oz behind the scenes, but I also found that I really love teaching again. And that's because I was able to pare it down to the real essentials of why I'm doing it. So definitely the cultural exchange and seeing students, the joy that students feel using these different apps. I mean, we have them using these technologies, I assume, that we're able to use to really elicit great responses from our students. And right, meeting people, getting insights and cultures, right. And all of those things that we love about teaching. And we will continue. So please keep thinking about that as we continue on. My next, where did I? So this is my roadmap to today's talk. What I'm going to do is briefly talk about some of the affinities, just to sort of reiterating what some of the affinities are of language learning and social emotional learning. And then I'm going to talk about identifying bottlenecks to learning, and specific ones that I found. I'm a college level teacher. I've done some curriculum writing for the middle school, but those of you who are in K through 12 will be able to add to what my experiences are. I'm sure there's others that I haven't identified that you will have. I'll also talk a little bit about motivation, and then I'm going to make the case. This whole talk is about making the case for why reflections, rubrics, and peer critique routines for self-awareness and responsible decision-making and also creating a safe and predictable space to develop a growth mindset, why this is so important. And we can't forget this as part of the mix, is part of the recipe that we'll be using. So that is the micro level. My larger goal in all of this, because that's how I think, is I want us to think about these reflections, rubrics, and routines as kinds of scaffolds. And these are the scaffolds, using these scaffolds to create the conditions for positive group and class interaction and attitudes, to make thinking and learning visible. And so when we talk about what I'm presenting is more of a mechanical or perhaps structural about what does language learning look like. So it's not just what about a language learner can do, but how you can help students make language learning their own endeavor. So no matter what I teach on Monday, and we're all trying to figure out what we're going to teach for class, I always want to see how it fits into the larger goals for the course. So it's not just a discrete activity. And I want us to think of also these cell components and other components that we're using as not just discrete activities, but use these as a way to approach the course or what we're teaching holistically. So what I will focus on and hoping you'll come away with today is that you will have a better understanding or some ideas about how to think or how to convey to your students how to think and act like a language learner. So we know that CEL establishes practice for a learning mindset and disposition, and that our language learning covers much, if not all of this. We certainly, especially in social awareness and relationship skills, there's a lot of comparison, cultural comparison, there's a lot of turn taking, and there's a lot of points of view that get exchanged. It's also in our self-awareness and social awareness, we'd work a lot with the intrapersonal and interpersonal aspects. And so these are things that, especially as teachers, we develop an affective relationship with our students. We get to know them personally, their likes, their dislikes, their plans for the weekend, the summer, their birth dates, their family relationships, their food preferences, their dietary restrictions. I learned at one point that one of my college students had high cholesterol. So the rest of the class learned not just the word for high cholesterol in Chinese, but they also learned about proper dietary management to make sure that her cholesterol doesn't rise or high. I've had students from overseas, a student from Estonia, for instance. And so all the students learn about cultures also from Estonia, but they also learn how to learn about different culture and cultural practices. Also, even if I have shy and reticent students, especially if they don't want to reveal too much about themselves, I always tell them from the beginning of the class, this is the place for them to invent themselves. They can be whoever they want. They can tell me they have 80 siblings. And I said, that's fine. You can tell me you have 80 siblings. And I'm going to say, really? And you're going to say back to me, I tell them, really? And I'm going to be, okay. Not a problem. So it's also a place for the students who are more shy and reticent to also use this as a place to try out things. So we give them a lot of places to practice. We have lots of rehearsal in our language classes. We rehearse these competencies through role play, homework, in-class exercises, pair and group work. And so it's a very creative space. We also, in this practicing, we are not just teaching the students the material, the specific knowledge of language, but also they're practicing behaviors that will help them develop their knowledge of themselves as well as others. We do this with pair activities, information gap activities, activities where students have to learn to listen to what the other is saying. And so what we find is that SEL enhances the positive experiences of learning and diminishes the negative, and it helps students to become lifelong learners and independent learners. But language learning does not explicitly employ self-awareness, self-management, and responsible decision-making. These are not necessarily explicit in our teaching, even though these are essential components of our learning. So I'm wondering if you can identify in these areas of self-awareness, self-management, and responsible decision-making, if you can come up with some of those areas that you find your students have difficulty with in the language classroom. So in self-awareness, self-management, and responsible decision-making, in those areas, such as identifying their emotions, self-confidence, stress management, impulse control, self-motivation, or in analyzing a situation and solving problems or identifying problems, do you find, where do you find your students have some difficulties if you're able to write those? Yeah, responsible decision making, not motivating themselves to study on their own for enough hours. Oh, yes, definitely. So I know it takes a while to type, so you don't need to write complete sentences, but I certainly want us to get a sense of, and you don't even have to write something here, but I want us to get a sense of that these are areas that we are not always explicit with in our teaching. So certainly how do you boost self-confidence? And how do you have the confidence to make mistakes? Yeah. At my institution, the students we share with science students are often in our language classes, and they tend to feel that they can make more mistakes in our language classes than they can in the science classes. So it's quite interesting, these perceptions that they have about learning. So how can we incorporate these areas or all of these SEL practices into our own teaching? I want to first look at and identify, if you can help me identify, one negative or frustrating experience you had as a language student. So when you were studying language, so that could be anywhere between, in school, so in a school setting, take a moment to think about a frustrating language learning experience. And if you can identify where it came from, this might require a little bit more thinking than we have time here, but if you think about, was it your own lack of preparation because of whatever circumstance? Was it an emotional or physical circumstance or circumstances that happened outside the classroom? Was it your lack of interest in the topic? You weren't really connecting what was going on in the classroom with your own interests and desires. Did your teacher misunderstand your own intentions or your engagement? Or was the teacher not providing sufficient reasons as to why you were learning? So not finding the environment in the practice, yeah. Not enough communicative work. Oh yes, I hear that a lot. Not having enough communicative work to learn, to do the practicing, and difficulties comprehending specific concepts. Oh, this is rich. So we've all had these negative or frustrated learning experiences. Absolutely. We probably have more than enough to share. But these are absolutely important things to reflect on. And one of the things that I want us to think about is, what are the barriers to learning? What are these cognitive and emotional barriers? So we understand the affective factors that in second language learning, it can predict the performance in students' performance. And some of these affective behaviors are motivation, attitude, and anxiety. Every student is going to process and have a different experience with these language learning. So if you think about why you love languages, and then also one of those not so exciting experiences that you had, there's a real disconnect there between what your joy is and what your interest is, and what was the condition, what the conditions were within the classroom. And so these affective realities also relate to students' emotions, their self-esteem, their empathy and anxiety, their attitudes towards learning. And I went a slide ahead too soon, but I wanted to, before I speak to the specific slide that I'm on, I was fascinated to find that a 2016 Gallup poll, student poll, found that 50% of middle and high school students are not engaged or are actively disengaged in school. That a 2020 Yale study of high school students said that they had negative feelings most of the time, and that 80% were stressed, and that 70% were bored. This is a huge, these are large numbers of students who are not feeling engaged, they're actively disengaged, as it says, or feeling bored or stressed. And this is even, I think you could even say it's even before COVID. And I'm not even talking about how we as instructors feel. But we certainly know that these negative experiences mean that they're missing out on learning. And if we are feeling these negative experiences too, we're missing out on learning as teachers. So one of the things that I want to bring up here is a lot of this can be, I think, where I have sort of come to think of it, is ways that we can sort of decode why we have these bottlenecks to learning. And some of the interesting things I found is that all disciplines require some form of a mental task or a mental operation or a mental framework, and that they have to be learned in addition to learning the content material. So we can identify these bottlenecks to learning and help students overcome them. Do they not know how to study? Do they spend enough time on that task? We can also uncover the mental tasks that are needed to overcome the bottleneck. Well, how do experts think? How do successful language learners and language users think? We can break down the mental tasks involved into manageable chunks to help move the student from novice to expert. We're in the expert realm now. We forget what it was like to be a novice learner. And so it's a matter of going back down to those small manageable chunks to help build that step by step, by modeling these tasks and designing ways to help students move through these new ways of thinking. And then we can give students practice and feedback by via collaborative work, by critical thinking. And these are things that we're very good at, especially when we're doing the collaborative work with pair thinking or pair work and group work. We can also motivate and lessen resistance by making our classrooms more student-centered, giving students choice and voice and a public platform to the world. And so in so doing, we can help relate their emotional and cognitive challenges and the procedural challenges. Well, this is what you have to do. You have to sit down and study so many, minutes or hours a day. so that we can change the emotional response that students have to learning. A lot of this can be preconceptions of the world that they have, like, oh, language learning is hard, or that I can't do this, or where do I even begin? And so we can't necessarily always change the emotional aspect of language learning, so that we have to recognize what our limitations are as teachers, but we can certainly create the conditions for changing the cognitive thinking, the way of thinking and behaving within these contexts that can help change the emotional response. So we can assess also students' mastery, find out what's unclear for the students, what do they find most difficult, and also find out concretely what they have learned or mastered with the content and the concepts. And so this is one way of teaching students how to learn as well as what to learn. And this goes beyond what we would traditionally define as a textbook or curriculum. So most of us as teachers teach the way we were taught. I learned Chinese with teachers, and I remember being absolutely in fear of talking to the teacher because my tones weren't accurate, that my pronunciation wasn't correct. And that was a kind of barrier. I thrived in that moment, in that context, but so many people don't. And you have to think about where are these barriers that are keeping students from enjoying the language and being also successful in learning it. So if you can think about for a minute, if you can identify, and you don't have to write in the chat, but can you identify a teaching strategy that you inherited and that you might be using that can contribute to one of those thinking bottlenecks that does not necessarily help your students become successful in decoding the language, of learning how to learn a language. So why did I bring up this decoding, the concept of decoding and bottlenecks, is because I want us to think more holistically in our approach to learning, not just about knowledge facts like grammar, vocabulary, and what cultural context to put something in, but also the mindset, the attitude, and the disposition to learn these things, which are so important. And this will help students transfer that content knowledge and see the practical application. So what motivates your students? It took me a while to learn that I can't make somebody be motivated, that I can set up the conditions for them to feel motivated, but I have no control over whether they are or they not. We do know that teacher preparation sets the stage for meaningful, human-centered, and community-building activities and communication. So when I looked at, for instance, who are my students, I learned that they are an interesting, incredible group that are most likely to engage in risky behavior. So some examples are financial literacy, going into debt, not understanding how to balance their credit card if they've been given a credit card, media literacy, diet and nutrition. Most of them don't eat, college students don't eat, skip meals and don't exercise. And so the Partnership for 21st Century Skills and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are some examples of organizations that have that I have turned to help in looking at what are some of those real world issues and what are the real world concerns that the students are facing today. I also know that high school and college age students are seeking self-authorship. They want to have a sense of self. They want to be autonomous. But there are still some obstacles to that learning and moving that behavior. So these are some of where my students are, and this is where I thought to move as a way to help clear that pathway to make and those bottlenecks to help for more effective and successful language learning. So one of the things I did, and this is all what I've done with online, is this is the banner for our online site for the course, and as you can see, I've done away with what a traditional syllabus looks like. It automatically communicates here that we're not just going to be learning language and grammar, We're learning conversations, reflection, engagement, inspiration, connections, and ideas. This is already setting the stage to change the way students think. I often, though not always, will use a participation affirmation statement for learners, especially if they're coming from different academic disciplines or in contexts where they are used to being lectured to, more passive learning settings. And to let them know that these are going to be specific types of activities that are required of them, so they can begin to think about, ooh, how do I like to work this way, or do I not like to work this way? So I'm not going to ask you to read everything on all these texts that I have in here. I'll pull out the salient terms and phrases that I want to use with you in these next few slides. But I'm helping the students know that they're going to be working with teachers, with peers, with people outside of the classroom in small group work, with pairs. They're going to make presentations, they're going to be doing skits, and that they have to be actively engaged. And so this is already letting them know from the outset that this is what's happening. What I've also done is I've come to unpack the language learning process so as to create new cognitive relationships to language learning. The image on the left, you don't need to read the fine print details, but what it is, it's a course map. It's showing students that this is what we're doing, and it's circular, meaning this is an ongoing process. And to the left, I'd explain in the image to the right what I do in terms of explanation is that I'm telling them already that language learning is more than just memorization of vocabulary and grammar, which a lot of students think it is. It's about developing core competencies for future careers and relationships. And it's about learning how to be an autonomous learner and about growing emotionally as well as intellectually. And it's about being self-reflexive in addition to being a team player. And so this map outlines the metacognitive pathway for the course. They may not know yet what metacognitive even means, but that's okay. And I tell them here, I'm always here to make sure you don't get lost. So this is how I take them through their journey. So I'm going to take you a little bit through their journey of what they do, just some of those things. So the beginning, we start off with having them identify for me what their language learning experiences are. Have they learned a language before? Why are they in this class? What are they curious about this class, about Chinese? Do they have prior knowledge about Chinese culture? What interests them? I also ask them about, or to think about, their learning preferences. Are they more active learners? Are they more reflective learners? Do they need things to be concrete and very detailed, or do they think in terms of the big picture? Are they more visual? Are they more verbal? Do they need things in a logical sequence, or are they more global thinkers? And so it's a way of helping them to sort of begin to sort of think and understand about how they think and how they operate and how they best learn. And then I also have them talk about learning goals. So you can have them I will have them sometimes do what's called SMART goals. So those are goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. And this is an example here of one student's goals about what she thinks and wants to happen. This is really at the onset of a course. And what I'm trying to do here in this is put the students in the driver's seat. I want them to be able to have the voice and the choice to say what direction their learning is going to take. I want them to help design that route that they're going to take. I want them to identify who and what can help me, peers, native speakers, maybe some apps that are available. I also want them to identify a plan of what to do when, and identify how they know if things are going well or not. And it's a way of trying to get them to think beyond, I'm doing this just for the grade. It's like, well, if you're doing this just for the grade, what does that mean? What does that look like? Especially at the college level. But I know that middle school and high school students are also wanting to know why they're studying things. I also know that we are innately curious as human beings. And I'm fascinated by what we're discovering in neuroscience and cognitive psychology on how we learn. So I also share that with the students about how we learn, learning how the brain learns, and also helping them know that this is actually how it feels to learn a language. And this is also what it looks like to be a successful learner. So again, this is why I'm telling them why they're learning these specific activities, so that they understand that when we're practicing, when we're reflecting, when we're doing things in the target language, they have an understanding of why this is happening. They know why this is going on. So an example would be here would be what I show them. What happens to you? What happens to your brain when you're learning a language? The students love it when I pull out the fMRI or the PET scan studies of language learning. They get excited to see, oh, this is how the brain lights up. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's why you're so exhausted after your first week of class with me. But when you keep practicing, that brain gets your brain gets adjusted and it gets used to learning. But I also think it's important for the students to learn not just what's happening in terms of the pragmatics of language, but that they're learning more than just these linguistic elements, but that there's also other things that are happening in their brain that's good for them. And especially for our students who are interested in the sciences and learning how things work, this is a really exciting thing for them. For those students who aren't as interested, that's okay. I also show them what their brain feels like, the feelings that they feel. And so these are just examples of feeling sleepy, of foolish, antisocial, exasperated. And I said, yeah, but these are all temporary until your brain adjusts. And so when you have students who are reluctant to speak in class and say, yeah, it's kind of feeling like it's a difficult day. So they're aware that their feelings they're not alone in their feelings and how they go about thinking as they go through the process of learning. I also give them an indication of what does a successful language learner look like. Yes, I can bring in videos. Yes, I can bring in work from former students, but I can also show them that these are the things that we're going to be practicing as in the classroom itself, and that you too are going to be able to follow this path. And so those are some of the things that I show them. I also have, if you look at the way I do grade distribution and I make it very clear to them, is that it's pretty much equal across all aspects. And that is because I tell them that your first year of learning a language, actually your first two, at least in Chinese, is really learning how to learn a language. And so you're really trying to learn how to balance. You're trying to walk and talk and chew gum and do all these things at the same time. So metaphors I find are really helpful with the students. So this is also taken from the course website. In the blue box, I give you more detail of the text that I say, but I use the metaphor of the brain as a muscle and that it's a total body workout and that you can't lift the heavy weights and run the marathon before you've trained those individual muscles. And that language learning is working different mind muscle groups so that language is both a mind and body effort. So students appreciate that metaphor. This is an example of how I've broken down the course lessons into manageable chunks on that website. So you can see it's very clear to the students, the map that we're going to be following, again, the different lessons and areas. And what I also realize is that some students don't know, well, how am I supposed to study? What am I supposed to do? How does this hand works here and this hand works there? What do I do? Especially with the language that doesn't have, where the written and the spoken is very different. I've given them a lesson map. Again, I'm not asking you to read everything that's on this slide, but what I want you to notice here is what I've put is that students begin to see at the top here that they're working with my peers and the professor. I'm working on my own. I'm working outside of class. I'm working with my peers and the professor and on my own, and it goes in this circular, predictable manner so that students always know what to expect. I also show them, okay, this is how you start learning, and I break it down into these different components. Again, these different bite-sized chunks. And you can see how I tell them there's no correct order, but this is what they're building in their language toolkit to practice regularly in these small chunks. And then my learning online website also shows them, so they have to complete this by a certain time period that we've given them, but they have the choice to do the listening practice or do the character practice or do a cultural competency. And I also include a fun for me. They have to do a fun for me, something that they enjoy doing that's not related to having to do it because the teacher said so. So this is a daily language practice guide that I give to them and say, you mix and match, you bring this together and see what works for you. How does it work for you? Do you practice characters today and do a fun for me? Do you do a reflection? Do you do listen to the audio? That it really is up to the students, again, choice within parameters of how to learn. And this is a way that I say will help the students with their own personal growth, that they'll be able to then start making connections. And having that choice, I help guide them towards making connections to the things that are interests beyond the classroom, but that they are interested in themselves, so they can connect language learning to the rest of the world and to interact with others. So we use the same rubrics for the whole 4 years of the college. It's modified a little bit for upper level, lower level, but the teachers and students use the same rubrics for everything, so that students are very familiar with how they're being assessed always. So students become conversant in that. And when we have checkpoints, I have them revisit. So I have them do self-evaluations and goals assessments. So I'll bring back their goals that they started with me at the beginning of the term, and I'll have them revisit. How are you doing? Are things working for you? Are they working as planned? If not, what needs to be tweaked? How can we tweak this? So that they learn how to use this kind of evaluation on themselves, but also in their peer work. If they're working on a task or a project, I will have them have designated roles. This works especially well in breakout rooms, and so that they all have specific roles that they play. And so we always have someone who's an equity officer to make sure that people are equally sharing in ideas, that there's not just one person speaking or two people speaking more than others, someone who takes notes and records, someone who directs the project or the task or keeps them on time, and someone who checks for understanding, who really makes sure that everybody is understanding if there are any sort of ambiguities or questions or concerns, so they all can play a role together. So these are some of the ways in which I have built a community for students and our courses. So we frequently will praise each other with what we can call warm fuzzies by saying you're great. We can also say, I can't remember that word, or I don't know how to do this. And so you can say, help, right? And we use these expressions in the target language. But this is how we create a sense of a team or of a community of people working together, where we share all of our strengths together. Finally, it's towards the end, which we don't need to go into here, but I also have them evaluate the learning process, have a portfolio, and plan next moves. Where are they going to go next? And I won't say this one here, I can come back later, but I will say how students have responded to, that was just sort of some of the things that they can do at the end. I can talk about that later, the actual activities that they've done. But that students have said that to this kind of making learning visible to the students, that they've enjoyed the learning journals. A student enjoyed writing out her thoughts and emotions, that these were pathways to help her learn. She was able to follow the activities, and she encourages students to also, future students, to also use this to reflect and remind themselves on how to improve their weak points and never forget their strong points. Another student says, I'm at my best when I'm helping others do their best, and I've made great friends through the class. That they continue to support each other and study together and just hang out and speak Chinese. So they're automatically then using this language outside of the classroom. One student writes that throwing oneself into the shark tank for language is one way to go, but that you actually end up knowing more than you think. So feeling okay with ambiguity. This is a student who started off not feeling so secure about that ambiguity of language learning, but recognize that he or she was able to build that toolkit to unlock that meaning once you thought you didn't know, or things that you thought were unknown. And another student has written about how it's a huge advantage to have the classmates, and so that we helped each other out and became good friends, and that they do activities. And certainly COVID has made it harder to interact, but they found creative ways around it. So those are some ways in which these kinds of conditions have set it up for us to have that magic potion in the classroom. So to sum up, cell fits in a lesson at the beginning, middle, and end. And this is from the signature practices playbook, and there are other examples of these kinds of activities that you can do. They're engaged, they're welcoming, they're inclusive, they're engaging, and they're optimistic. I won't go into more detail on that, but I do want to say that in speaking with you today, I hope that I have helped make the case for why things like reflections and rubrics, peer critique and routines are helpful and useful in scaffolding student learning to create positive group interaction and to both make learning and thinking visible. And to conclude, I would love to hear from you at least one thing you think you've learned from my talk today, and one thing that you would like to know more about, things that you might investigate more. So I don't know if you have a chance, or if there's no time, we can go straight to questions.
We definitely have some time, and I have some questions that came in, but let's take a look and see what's coming in on the chat. We've got great comments talking about visual syllabus. That might be something I'm planning on checking out and leveraging, just making it a little bit more visual for the students, keeping it fun. Some other things that are coming in. I'm just going to make my chat box a little bigger so I can see a little bit better.
Yeah, I love the language learner brain. Students love this. Middle school students love this. Middle schoolers are so curious. And if you give them something about the brain and neuroscience, they'll run with it. They'll absolutely run with it. So more open-ended rubrics, yeah, or holistic rubrics. And I think I hate grading. One of the things I hated, I was going to have you guys say that, but I thought, no, we don't want to talk about downers. But I hate creating tests and grading. And when I got rid of tests and did these different kinds of task-based assessments or different kinds of assessments and had these rubrics, it just became much more enjoyable because I was able to see through the test as the barrier and really think about it, these rubrics as really helping students with their growth and learning how to learn. Yeah, also learning about cell. And what does a peer critique look like at the novice and intermediate level? You can notice that I've done some of this, and I've done most of this is framework setting up in English, and I think it's okay to be using that as a way of teaching the students how to do this. You can create language scaffolds where you can teach students at a novice level and at an intermediate level how to be positive, how to critique positively, and maybe not go into as much detail, but there's certainly ways that you can do that.
We have a question in the question box.
Sure.
Sabrina would like to know, could you give more specific examples of strategies to share with students to learn a language?
More specific strategies.
You tell them to spend a certain amount of time, or do you tell them to do spaced repetition?
So I have it in those different discrete areas. So for instance, for learning characters or learning sounds, listening, I have very specific guidelines. I don't give it to them all at once because it'll be too overwhelming and it'll be too teacher-centered. I seek what they're interested in, and I'm like, oh, but let's try this and repeat it after me, or repeat it. How many times can you repeat it? You have to repeat it 3 times, or repeat this 4 times, or listening activity. See if you can imitate it. You're going to feel funny imitating these sounds, but it's okay, you know. I will. So I have these. I find usually I will ask the students where they find the most difficulty, and then I'll work individually in my instruction with them on how to what kinds of activities to do. And over the course of having taught for many years, then you begin to see a pattern of where certain students have certain issues. And so there's some that need the characters, and you don't study for a character exam for 8 hours on Sunday for the exam or test on Monday. You break it down to small chunks. And I make it fun and humorous. as a way to say, but you can bring out your flashcards while you're waiting in line, and all your friends are going to look over their shoulder and say, oh, she's so cool, she's learning Chinese characters, to do your 5 minutes of character practice, for instance. So that's when it's an example that I will use.
And as a Japanese instructor, I can certainly relate. I love having the ability to send my students off with things like Quizlets, and they can do their flashcards at their leisure on their phones, which is fantastic. Well, Megan, it has been fantastic having you with us this evening, and definitely gave me a lot to think about, some new things I'm looking forward to implementing. And we really want to thank everyone for being here. And Megan, thank you so much for sharing with us. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody.